who also does not hear our prayers.
I'd never felt how much they take for granted. I mean, they can walk so stealthily, and then all of a sudden it was just, like someone was playing a symphony in my house.
Right.
Gavin.
Learned the divine arts and sciences from the fallen angels. The guilty man is eminently suitable and is therefore.
That's a really good soundbite. Learn the arts from the fallen angels. You should use that as a text.
Only to be loved.
Yeah, we need that. Okay, well, I apologize, folks, but the good news is that video clip, which is literally the undead, I can't figure out how to get rid of the damn thing. I've actually deleted it multiple times, and it just won't go away.
You can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of.
But anyway, the good news about it is that it is over in 3 minutes and 12 seconds, and it's almost to the end now, so it should stop soon.
Apocalyptic violence, wrath,
and,
fellow creatures.
good evening to our regular YouTube.
Almost godlike power.
Let's see.
He can no longer remain blind and unconscious.
Yeah. Good evening to our YouTube followers. Hello, Neil. My vision is good enough. Is not good enough. I see Neil. Nell, I thought, but it's Neil. So welcome.
I that in such a way that there are so many kick butt sound bites. Just if you just clip them out of context, that's a great intro.
Well, it is over now.
It's like 18 PhD questions, they're layered right through there.
Right. So good evening, Justin. Nice to see you tonight. And so tonight we're going to start with 2 essays on analytical psychology. And we're actually beginning with paragraph 1. And the great thing about this part of this book is that it really discusses the history of psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis. And so what I want to do is just read it one paragraph at a time and then allow commentary on it. There's not much in the first 2 paragraphs, but let me start with that. So paragraph 1, if he wants to help his patient, the doctor, and above all, the specialist of nervous diseases. Now, mind you, this essay was written, it was written about the turn of the century, of the 20th century, so 1898, maybe as early as 1893, I don't know. But anyway, if he wants to help his patient, the doctor, and above all, the specialists for nervous diseases, must have psychological knowledge. For nervous disorders and all that is embraced by the terms nervousness, hysteria, etc., are of psychic origin, and therefore logically require psychic treatment. Cold water, light, fresh air, logically required psychic treatment. Electricity and so forth have at best a transitory effect, and sometimes none at all. The patient is sick in mind, and in the highest and most complex of the mind's functions, and these can handily be said to belong. These can hardly be said to belong anymore to the province of medicine. Here, the doctor must also be a psychologist, which means that he must have knowledge of the human psyche. So he's, as a psychiatrist, as a created psychiatrist, MD, he was making a distinction between his MD work and psychology. So any comments here first?
I have a comment. I feel like, in a sense, he's hinting at a definition he's going to provide of what the human psyche is. And the wording here reminds me of my friend who goes to a psychopharmacologist on a regular basis. So
Boy.
for things like nervousness, hysteria, things that I might take a cold shower, right, to deal with, she's going and getting a new prescription here,
Yeah.
there, and and she's roughly 76 years old, right? She's been doing this for at least 50 years, maybe more than 50 years of frequenting the arena or the, I guess it's just the medicine gist of psychopharmacology. So that's what this makes me think of. It doesn't make me think about Freud, the couch, dreams, anything. It makes me think of that.
Opioid. Makes me think of opioid addiction, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate you said that, Annabelle, because I had the same sense that he was just simply making the distinction between, I mean, a psychologist can't prescribe medicine, but a psychiatrist has 4 more advanced years and was an MD first, so they can prescribe medicine and or pharmacological substances. I hesitate to call psych meds any kind of medicine. They seem to delete the human body's capability for balance. But I think you're right. I mean, they're making the distinction between the psychologist is versed in psychological phenomenon and through anecdotal experience and medicine, but or medical procedures, but the psychiatrist is able to prescribe. And that's interesting that person is, your friend has been for 50 years. I kind of, part of me thinks psychiatry should be illegal. It's like, I actually was writing a novel where the hunters made psychiatry illegal and psychology required because you don't dope the deer before you figure out how to catch them. And it feels like they'll medicate before they investigate. And that to me is dangerous because it's like it's beyond the observer changes the context. They're changing the psychological natural pharmacology of the brain before they even get deep into. I remember going to a psychiatrist by mistake, thinking I was going to a psychologist. And it was just after a bad relationship breakup, one of those you just kind of get blown out of the water. And within 5 minutes, well, we're going to put you on. I went, whoa, wait a second. You don't even know me from Adam. That's medicate before investigate. That's not even scientific. That's fear-based anxiety medicine. What chart did you put me on? I didn't realize it came to B.F. Skinner. It's behaviorist multiplication tables. So anyway, but I appreciate you brought that up because it is just that distinction between the two.
And did you take any medication for that?
No, I got up and promptly walked out. And he said,
Oh.
well, probably the problem with your relationship is you just quit. And I said, no, I'm a businessman too. And I don't deal with people who are quacks and irresponsibly reactionary. I prefer responsive people. And if you're pigeonholing me in 5 minutes, there's no point of value. And basically then I stopped and I gave him a sermon. I mean, I think I was there for 20 minutes and I may have quoted, I think I quoted Mysterium Conjunctionis and Ion like extensively because back then I just could spit the chapters and I left and he was just, so, it's like.
Yeah, well, meanwhile, I think our friend
Takes
John
his pill
Jackson,
right away.
I think our friend John
Jackson.
Jackson, who is a psychiatrist, basically said that he had to make himself into a psychologist in order to do his work.
Nice.
Most of the time.
That's integrity right there. I mean, that's integrity to understand and comprehend that.
Yeah.
I like the way you framed what you said, Jordan, though, because you talked about the deer being drugged, and especially having talked about the elk pounding by, it made me think of the notion of captivity and the fact that I believe, and I work in pharma, I think I have revealed it, I edit it. So it's not,
Right.
I'm not responsible. I'm only responsible for commas and capitalizations and things like that. But that notion of being made a captive and what captivity is, and even just sitting at a desk, going to a job, I think one of the roles of psychiatry, and this does go to, my extensive reading of Freud and his use of cocaine and his relationship with police and all this other stuff, is, and also Vernee's, and his work in, developing advertising. The mind of the people needs to be receptive and prepared to, kind of, what is it, like function in the prison of life, function within the constraints of post-industrial revolution life, right? Sit in this chair for 4 hours, and then you can take a break and go pee and get a cup of coffee, and then sit in this chair for another 4 hours or something like that, right? That's captivity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Take your time.
I'm having an aged mind game going on me here, but I know the name. I know I have her book here. Maybe I'll get lucky. Not that book. I'm too close to my bookshelf to be able to see. Nope, not neither of those two books. I'll get it.
Well, Annabelle, while Skip's looking there, I is that the story of Alice? That there you go. And I mean, honestly, too, the anti-hysterical bias of the psych professional being present so that they're not startled by almost anything, and are able to then treat what I find to be psychological intensities that, yep. And even there's a book by Kay Redfield Jamison called Touched with Fire.
Yeah.
And it's about the psych-induced suicide rates with
Exactly.
the premier top artists through several centuries, and the ones that didn't, because they acclimated to their intensities, or basically were unapologetic and had problems with society, but they didn't have problems with themselves. So that unthreatened piece, I think, can raise someone up to their own intensity. There's some rumble periods, you go through that, but at the same time, the captivity I appreciate you brought the captivity concept up, because even
you did, Jordan.
Well,
drugging the deer.
Drugging the deer, right? But then with the technical term, captivity, in the 20th century, post-industrial and industrial, what I find is a lot of civilization disconnects people from nature. I mean, heck, even having to wait to pee. I mean, the Zen master would say, well, when you need to pee, pee. When you're hungry, eat. I mean, sleepy, sleep kind of thing. But I find that civilization itself, when it gets as severe and intense as it is now, often removes ourselves from nature. I mean, you have basically forest giants and concrete pots, in urban landscape architecture. But I think that removing from people from nature induces the constant bodily irritation. And then civilization itself causes uncivilized behavior. And part of that is, psych. And part of it is just the fact that we're removed from nature. Of course, we're a little whacked every once in a while.
I remember what it was she said, but now I remember who said it. It's Anne Belford Ulinoff, of course. And what I've found is an interesting trick, although I have to tell our fans here that at some point I'm going to have to give up doing this, because my grandfather gradually lost his compus mentis, and I don't want to be a drag on the system. So far, I'm able, because I have a broad knowledge, I'm able to say, well, okay, I can't remember it right there, but I can think of something else that makes me think of it. So I did that. So Annabelle Ulanoff said in her Psyche and the Soul, or that at the first level in psychology, and she's a psychiatrist and a theologian and was professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary, believe it or not. I'd never heard of anybody else like that. But she said, at the first level, when you're talking to someone, often you can solve their problem by just saying, oh, that happened to me, and talk about how it happened to me individually, right?
Normalized. Right.
Yeah, normalized. And then the second level is when the psychologist, psychiatrist can say, that happens to everybody. Right. And it's only in the third level where the psychiatrist or psychologist really has to start digging down and trying to understand where the problem is. And very often, I believe, and I think Jordan believes, that just a coffee with a friend is one form of therapy. And that if most mental troubles are resolved if you can go talk to a friend about it. And then at the middle level, you have the tarot and other forms of divination, which Jordan does professionally, where the reader can say a series of things that will jog your mind somehow. It will catch something in your psyche and make you think, that's me, right? And
interesting part of that too is that now that I've realized that 60% of my clients are licensed Jungian analysts, and they're my favorite clients. They get it, already. So, but I'm starting to feel like they can talk to me about things professionally that they wouldn't to other colleagues, just for fear of reprisal from the silo, etc. And they've almost become more human in a way, and takes it into that, friend to friend, because a friend won't pull a punch too. A friend can hit you as hard as a psychiatrist with a comment, because they're like, no, you do that all the time. You better own it. It's like,
well, now I'm getting good advice from our online chat, where they're telling me to take vitamin B12. And meanwhile, we've been hammered with Prevagen for the last decade or so on television. So Debbie and I have actually talked about starting to take Prevagen. God help us.
I think B12, rosemary, basil, and COQ10, and I'm good to go. I mean, and the B12 like once a month. I mean, it's just enough to keep the balance. But only over the cashier counter, not over the prescription counter for me.
So Justin says, good source for B12 is cheese and other milk products, difficult to get when you're a vegan. Okay, well, I'm not a vegan and I do eat those things, but let's move on to paragraph 2, where we won't really crack into the history of psychoanalysis. So
don't forget your kale for the calcium, because it's better than, milk is a big 1950s marketed mess for that.
Okay.
Only white things have calcium.
Molasses.
Molasses, yes.
Yeah.
Do you have the book, Jordan? Okay, Annabelle, please read paragraph 2.
In the past, That is to say, up to 50 years ago. So that would have been 1849. The doctor's psychological training was still very bad. His psychiatric textbooks were wholly confined to clinical descriptions and the systematization of mental diseases. And the psychology taught in the universities was either philosophy or the so-called, quote, experimental psychology, close quote, inaugurated by Wundt. The first moves towards a psychotherapy of the neuroses came from the Charcot School at the Salpêtrière in Paris. Pierre Janet began his epoch-making researches into the psychology of neurotic states, and Bernheim in Nancy took up with great success Liébeault's old and forgotten idea of treating the neuroses by suggestion. Sigmund Freud translated Bernheim's book and also derived valuable inspiration from it. At that time, there was still no psychology of the neuroses and psychoses. To Freud belongs the undying merit of having laid the foundations of a psychology of the neuroses. His teaching sprang from his experience in the practical treatment of the neuroses, that is, from the application of a method which he called psychoanalysis, in italics. End of paragraph.
And there's this great scene in the movie A Dangerous Method, in which Jung and Freud are talking about what to call it. and Jung, Freud wanted to call it psychoanalysis in the movie, according to the movie, and he wanted to call it psychoanalysis, and Jung said, well, make it psychoanalysis, it sounds better. That's when they were starting out their good relationship. So who wants to take a crack at what a neurosis is?
Personally, I feel like it's an ingrained habit, usually hidden by a blind spot that someone is either unaware of, unconscious of, or conscious of and cannot move around, like a rock in the river. That's a feature of the mind that often then goes back to that nervousness or hysteria. It causes a reaction, I think, in the psyche, rather than a response.
Anxiety too, it causes, but Marilyn or Annabelle, you wanted?
Well, I think I have a different version of the book, so I'll have to get the other book. This is called 2 Essays on Analytical Psychology.
Yes.
But the text is different.
Wow.
No, it's a different text. I'll have to look for that. But I think in a neurosis, it's kind of whatever it is gets in your way. It's kind of an annoying thing that happens to you, but you're living in reality. Whereas with the psychosis, you're living in your own reality, but other people don't share it.
Yes.
And I think
Like
that's one of the main differences. So in a neurosis, it's kind of you're annoying people or you're annoying yourself, but you kind of can function in the world. You can have a job, you can make a living, you can feed yourself. It doesn't stop you from daily functioning.
Yeah.
But with the difference with the psychosis is it really interferes with your daily life behavior. That's my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Annabelle, you want to take a crack at this?
No.
Okay. All right. So my understanding is, your husband is cheating on you, so you have to decide whether to stick with him or move in with your lover. And you can't decide. It's a tough call which one. And so my understanding is it's two sides of the same coin, and you can't decide between the two. You can't consciously decide. And so you get into anxieties and depressions because you can't decide. Well, should I stay with my husband, who's the father of my 3 children, or shall I go with my lover who makes me happy every day? That kind of question, and vice versa. Okay, and
I think piggybacking right on that, Skip, I mean, the whole water conforms to its cup. If you're in a negative environment, it's gonna, no matter what, it's gonna get in. So if you don't choose the one right for you and balance with those two situations, that the old kind of adage, before you allow yourself to be diagnosed with a psychosis, just make sure you're not surrounded by a lot of a-holes. I mean, because it's like the chatter and the static just will mess you up. It'll basically mess up your own personal signals. If you don't have that authority of a sense of sovereignty where you're allowing yourself to be buffeted by the winds of what other people think.
Right. I never had psychotherapy, but I can say that, that actually was my choice, whether to stick with my wife of 17 years with 3 children, or move out and move in with my current wife, to whom I've been married with whom I've been for the last 35 years. And I never have doubted my decision. And I think it actually helped my daughters because my first wife wanted me to be her father. And I knew I could never do that. And I could never do that. And she was never going to accept anything else. And so I became pretty miserable in the relationship, so much so that I did have some affairs, a couple of affairs. And, finally I met my current wife, and we just connected and have been together ever since.
So it feels like you made a decision that you're going to stick to your guns to have an adult relationship, not a codependent, I'm your substitute parent that you haven't ever grown up from relationship.
Yeah, and my ex-wife did marry a man who was 10 years older than us, who in effect was like her father. Mm-hmm. And so she was feeling much more secure, and so was I, because I was in a relationship that was good for me. And
well, you got Debbie. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I got Debbie. That's right. And so if folks don't know what Jordan and I mean by that, then go put into this YouTube channel the words "The Vanishing Path" and listen to the only time that Debbie appeared in a wisdom path session, and you'll understand. And I get to be with her all the time, and she walks into the room, and well, it's like when Quinn the Eskimo comes, the pigeons all go to him. When Debbie comes, the pigeons all go to Debbie, and because she's the teacher. I mean, she's the one, and everybody experiences her in that way. And we have a few other people like that in our lives, but we work well together, it turns out. Thank goodness. Because I never imagined that I would divorce. And as I say, I was together with my first wife for 17 years. And so, when Debbie appeared in my life, and believe it or not, we're the first couple, I make the claim that we're the first couple to meet online and marry. Because we met online on August the 22nd, 1985, And we physically met 1 week later on August the 29th, 1985. And the commercial internet, what everybody knows as the World Wide Web today, didn't really get going until like December of 94. So we had met each other on an email network 9 years earlier. And, we were able to penetrate one another's psyches just by text messaging. Almost by not physically. We only met physically 3 times before I moved in with her. And so that was an interesting experience. But anyway,
If we could just revisit Marilyn's comment, I really appreciate your distinction where you mentioned the psychoses affect daily functions, whereas neuroses are more manageable, more akin to habits, as they were, whereas then psychoses become intense imbalance. And whether it's the rest of the psyche hadn't caught up to that piece, or that piece is so out of line. But I just appreciate your living in an reality in psychoses, but living in reality in neuroses. And, it's kind of lifelong. We all have our own bents, and, whether they're medically neuroses or they're just distinctions, can kind of be up for grabs sometimes.
so
Well, I'd
Go
like
ahead.
to, can I comment on this, please? But it's,
Please.
in those days when Freud and Jung were doing their work, we didn't have access to the information we have now. We now have access to so much information that you have 2 sides in the United States, 2 sides of the political way of looking at things. And people are getting information. In other times we'd say, oh, they're psychotic. They don't, but they're getting information from so-called trusted sources, and people are believing things that at a different time we'd say, oh, they're crazy. But now they're getting information that they believe is valid, so they won't get vaccinated, or they won't allow their children to be vaccinated. To me, it's a psychotic way of thinking, but they're coming from an information source. So I think the way to evaluate it is very different. And I don't know if these textbooks need to be rewritten now, taking into account the information that's available to us.
Yeah, they probably do need to be rewritten after Donald Trump, because I read the things that he says, and I realize that he's really behaving like someone who's infantile.
He's psychotic. I would say
Yeah.
he's psychotic.
I agree.
But then his believers, they're psychotic. They're not psychotic, but they're believing a psychotic person. It's like a cult.
Right.
So
Well, he came from the family with a monster of a father and a doormat of a mother. So you want to talk about extreme imbalance lifelong.
Yes.
That bent of zero boundaries, and it's almost like Joseph Goebbels, with Hitler. Make the lie big and repeat it. And the thing is, there are no alternative facts. Facts don't need adjectives, and it's the meme I always like to refer to is that when Ben Franklin consulted Abraham Lincoln on the invention of the internet, ... and then people, you'll hear them repeat, did Ben Franklin, when he was doing electricity, did he start? No, he did not. It was a joke, don't you know little history? So, I mean, the ability to discern, I think, is one of the primary features in navigating modern society.
Well,
So
we have
ever.
to remember my favorite statistic, that the man of the 16th century, and it was essentially men, only had as much information in a lifetime as appears in the Sunday New York Times, one edition. And so people just didn't know very much. And And so humanity has been changing dramatically since we've had more open communication.
And if you take the chart that has the technology curve and the evolution curve, the evolution curve does this and the technology curve does this.
Yeah.
So, the amount of information is far outweighed, outclassed, and exceeded the amount that can be processed. And, in 1700, you could probably know everything there was to know if you were diligent and conscientious enough and studied all the time. But now it's infinite.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, how do we connect that, which I agree completely. How do we connect that with psychology, with psychotherapy, when there's a bias now, or maybe not a bias, but there are different ways of looking at things that were not available. How do we fix that, or how do we incorporate that into when we're teaching new students or people are learning?
We have to grow up, don't we?
Have to individuate.
We have to individuate. And so what that means is, on January 6th, the people that were involved in that event didn't see there was anything wrong with it, right? And yet those people were committing crimes. And so...
And I bet some of their phone texts had things from their mom. Is it time to bring your Sammy for lunch now? I mean, it's like, I can't not there, Gene. I mean, to grow up.
So people are moving away from Trump now because all of a sudden they're realizing that there's something that's morbid about following him. And they realize, wow, these people got in trouble. Why did they get in trouble? And they start to have to ask questions. And so we saw how the whole thing flopped on last Saturday, where nobody showed up.
Well, and they start to realize, it seems, that he's not their substitute mentor, tormentor, their parent. The other word for the hyphenated mentor.
Right. They're not. He's not their mother, and he's not going to save them by giving them absolution if they do something that's not right.
And they started to maybe even realize that he's never completed a whole sentence in his life. I mean, always this ellipses and jump to the next, and it's evasive tactics and language, which then just kind of tries to hook someone and drag the fish along without ever bringing it into the boat.
Good way to put it. Yeah. So we could imagine what would have happened if they had actually caught Mike Pence and actually hung him. Then what? Then what? And meanwhile, the rest of us wouldn't tolerate that, not for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who did that would be tried for murder, right?
Interesting, right?
And then here's this thing with General Milley right now, where Trump is calling him a traitor. Well, wait a minute. He's not a traitor because his patriotism is to the Constitution, not to an individual.
That's a good point too, and I think it brings up the old adage of the accusation is worse than the crime, and he plays the accusation game, which just puts the poison seeds to distract people instead of people who just will look at him and go, "That's absurd," and just not even give him the time of day. I appreciate your question too, though, Marilyn. What do we do with this kind of multivariable society, or multinucleate? There's so many different centers. And I kind of look back to Freud and Jung. Freud would want you to be a lifelong client because you must be diseased. Well, because you're human. I'll go figure, lifelong. But Jung wanted people to learn themselves how to live the art of life, and not to be a lifelong client, to become basically their own psychotherapist, their own navigator in their own ship on their own path of life. And I think that's more evolved than my joke is always, Freud, oh, lie down and tell me about your mother. Well,
okay, there's a couple of comments here on the chat, on the YouTube chat, that are worthwhile. Lilly says, as an addition to Marilyn's comment, I'd say that even in Freud's and Jung's time, strong political forces also influenced their works and actions. Many of their ideas were abandoned due to this. And, I do agree with that. And Jung actually held back and didn't bring his work forward politically because he was raised in the church, and he didn't want to offend the church, and he didn't want to take a political position. Mm-hmm. And so he stayed out of it. And Freud escaped Vienna. That was a political position, I guess, and then went to London. But I think they both stayed out of it. But
I think that's a more evolved gesture from Jung, because taking the political position means you are biting into the sociology of the time and the culture, and instead of keeping a clear and discerning eye as to what the uniquenesses are that are different than the status quo, what the distinctions are that make the identity valid or horribly, absurdly invalid. You kind of, that own personal navigation. I mean, I think you said it with 2 words: grow up. I mean, it's the child has to become the parent of the man/woman. However, the child has to become the parent of the adult. And
right. Okay. And Justin then responds, according to academia itself, everything can be explained through scientific inquiry, achieved through research and publishing or more research. Well, I would say that actually, although that's what the scientific method says, just take a chessboard. I know a man who was the national collegiate champion in speed chess, and so that's 64 squares and 32 pieces on the board with rules. But human beings are quite a bit more slippery than chess pieces, and so we slip out every which way but loose, and it can't be explained. I mean, you can't explain the Grand Master through the scientific method. Well, maybe you can now, because maybe AI can beat a grandmaster at chess, but that's with that limit of 64 squares and 32 pieces and so on. But when you get out into the human world, it gets quite a bit more complicated than that. And that can't necessarily be taught.
Well, and AI, I mean, the distinction to me with AI is that AI is just a fast fascination with how quickly the facts can be spit back out in some solution. I mean, the joke in a cognition graduate philosophy course in college was there was just a cartoon, and the 2 AI philosophers were laboring over the table in the copy room saying, well, how will we finally know? How will we know when something is sentient? And the copier behind them leans back on the back casters and says, that reminds me of a story. I mean,
yeah, there's, Lilly Justin is making this point about academia and so on. And in the advanced group, we've been looking at this book, Alchemy, by Marie-Louise Valfrance. And there's one exchange in this book that I really love, because she's having an exchange with a theologian. And think of academia as, okay, everything's in books and they're up on the shelves, right? But but the theologian says to her, I think God has already given his unique answer in each case. And Valfrance says, that is where we differ. You think God has published general rules, which he keeps himself, and we think he is a living spirit appearing in man's psyche who can always create something new. Remark, within the framework of what he has already published, Von Franz, to a theologian, God is bound to his own books and is incapable of further publications. That is where we lock horns. And so whatever theologians say, it's typically found in books, and the books don't tend to wiggle very much.
Well, it held up the, the story of Alice, Queen of Hearts, off with the head. I mean, Maurice von Franz just off with that theologian's head. I mean,
Yeah.
just one fell swoop.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reverse of the show Chicago, which is you think your God is dead, but we think he's alive. Okay, paragraph 3, let's go on. Before we enter into a closer presentation of our subject, something must be said about its relation to science as known hitherto. Here we encounter a curious spectacle which proves yet again the truth of Anatole France's remark, les savants ne sont pas curieux, which I guess would mean the genius isn't curious. The first work of any magnitude in this field awakened only the faintest echo, in spite of the fact that it introduced an entirely new conception of the neuroses. A few writers spoke of it appreciatively, and then on the next page proceeded to explain their hysterical cases in the same old way. They behaved very much like a man who, having eulogized the idea or the fact that the earth was a sphere, calmly continues to represent it as flat. Freud's next publications remained absolutely unnoticed, although they put forward observations which were incalculably important for psychiatry. Then in the year 1900, Freud wrote the first real psychology of dreams, a proper Stygian darkness that hitherto reigned over this field. People began to laugh, and when he actually started to throw lights on the psychology of sexuality in 1905, laughter turned to insult. And this storm of learned indignation was not behindhand in giving Freudian psychology an unwanted publicity, a notoriety that extended far beyond the confines of scientific interest. Okay. Anybody want to comment on that one? Okay, hearing none. Paragraph 4. Accordingly, we must look more closely into this new psychology. Already in Charcot's time, it was known the neurotic system of the neurotic symptom is psychogenic, i.e., originates in the psyche. It was also known, thanks mainly to the work of the Nancy School, Nancy School, I guess, that all hysterical symptoms can be produced through suggestion. Equally, something was known, thanks to the researches of Genet, about the psychological mechanisms that produce such hysterical phenomena as anesthesia, paresis, paralysis, amnesia. But it was not known how an hysterical symptom originates in the psyche. The psychic causal connection were completely unknown. In the early 80s, Dr. Breuer, an old Viennese practitioner, made a discovery which became the real starting point for the new psychology. He had a young very intelligent woman patient suffering from hysteria who manifested the following symptoms, among others. She had a spastic, rigid paralysis of the right arm and occasional fits of absent-mindedness or twilight states. She had also lost the power of speech in as much as she could no longer command her mother tongue, but could only express herself in English, systematic aphasia. They tried at that time to account for these disorders with anatomical theories, although the cortical center for the arm function was as little disturbed here as with a normal person. The symptomology of hysteria is full of anatomical impossibilities. One lady who had completely lost her hearing because of an hysterical affection, that's affection, spelled with an A, often used to sing. Once when she was singing, her doctor seated himself unobserved at the piano and softly accompanied her. In passing from one stanza to the next, he made a sudden change of key, whereupon the patient, without noticing it, went on singing in the changed key. Thus, she hears and does not hear. The various forms of systematic blindness offer similar phenomena. A man suffering from total hysterical blindness recovered his power of sight in the course of a treatment, but it was only partial at first and remained so for a long time. He could see everything with the exception of people's heads. He saw all the people around him without heads. Thus he sees and does not see. From a large number of like experiences, it had been concluded that only the conscious mind of the patient does not see and hear, but the sense function is otherwise in working order. This state of affairs directly contradicts the nature of an organic disorder, which always affects the actual function as well. Okay, so that's pointing out that the neuroses are not actual disorders, they're psychological comments.
Back to paragraph 3, Marilyn's question again to me came up about what do we do with modern society, because Freud when he turned psychology onto sexuality, you get the Victorian prudishness, people, we don't talk about that. And so, Jung would say, thinking is difficult, that's why people judge. So they start judging from this uncomfortable, most likely infantile or juvenile sexual development, where it's something that they do, but they don't know what's driving, in a way, so that they turn to the insult and to try to take him down. And then that's the motley crew of the mob, of the crowd, or of the predominant sociology. That's basically the psychology of a culture that's going on. So I think it goes back to Marilyn's question of, well, how do we deal with all these, multivariable nonsense things and go for signal instead of noise?
Okay.
I'd like to go back to what you were saying, Skip, about the definition of neuroses, about decision, when you were talking about Debbie and about your first marriage.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that that has something to do with the parts of the brain. The executive function is prefrontal cortex. And if we go back to how neuroses were dealt with, or psychoses, I have a friend who received so many electric shock therapy treatments that his memory is just, almost entirely destroyed, which is very, very sad, because he had a tremendous wealth of knowledge, which is now, out in the ethers. So this paragraph is starting to go into that area of what are the parts of the brain and how is the brain and the various thinking and responding functions, how are they connected with the functionality of the body and the functionality of our moods and our behaviors and all that. I saw a movie about Charcot, and I just quickly looked it up. It was from 2012. I thought, was it that long ago? But
what was it called?
it's called Augustine. When I checked the date, I got the name. Anyway, it's about a patient of his. Yes, Augustine, 2012. Not an American movie, obviously, and directed by a woman. Importantly, the little brief description on IMDb, which is always so perfunctory, a look at the relationship between pioneering 19th century French neurologist Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot and his star teenage patient, a kitchen maid who was left partially paralyzed after a seizure. So this steps into exactly the area we were reading about, which is this, and that's what the movie was about, was that mind body,
Disconnect.
connection and
Yeah.
disconnection. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It was exploring that in a wonderful, and it's a beautiful period drama with lots of really great clothes and old French buildings that are not the glamorized ones. They feel like you're actually in one of those situations where there's no toilet and there's, they're carting the water around in buckets. Anyway, which I think is also an important, speaking to what Jordan said about human, evolution, neurological and everything else. And then technology, which takes this tremendous, zip line up and we're not connected up there. I mean, if you take mind and body, right, our bodies, our function have nothing to do with sitting in front of, again, my comparison, 4 hours at the computer and then you get to have a pee break. I mean, one thing has nothing to do with the other thing. Computer is just sitting there humming along, and corporate, reality is sitting there humming along. And where does the human fit in?
Yeah, that's a problem that can create a neurosis.
Well, I often wonder too, they use the word causative, all the time. And I think to then dial into the fine grain of what's causative, I mean, any trauma, any influence. I mean, trauma is not always negative. I mean, trauma could be the happiness of a birthday party. It's just an influence. But it feels like then those pieces make the indelible spots, and sometimes indelible blind spots that are then, and usually, for example, addictions, inhibitions usually root in those blind spots. So they're hard to even fathom, much less see. And then once you go looking, they're still kind of invisible. I mean, you have to kind of forensically feel your way around the mind.
The experience I had that is actually caught on video on this YouTube channel is that I knew that people had emotional experiences in museums, but it had never happened to me really. I mean, I'd seen things, I've been told, okay, this person did this, and so on. I guess I was particularly moved by the Burghers of Calais when I saw them at the Tokyo Museum of Western Art. But other than that, I wasn't particularly moved. And maybe I was moved a little bit by statues of nude women when I was in my teens. But I walked into a gallery in Boston Museum of Art that had a modern art exhibition. And the first thing that I went into was a room where there was, the exhibit was a table and 6 chairs that were 3 times normal size. And when you walked into that exhibit, oh my God, you walked under the table and you felt like you were 3 years old immediately. You felt like you felt when you were 3 years old. And then the very next gallery I walked into had a Jackson Pollock. And I've always thought about Jackson Pollock. Well, kindergartner could do that. What's that about? And I walked in, and here's this full-size Jackson Pollock, and it was actually drip painting number 31. And immediately I started to weep, and I had no idea why that happened. No idea. And, it took me about 10 minutes to get my composure. I had to sit down on a bench and get myself under control. And I'm looking at this drip painting and trying to say, what is there about this? Because Pollock made a point of not having anything that you could recognize in these drip paintings. And so why am I weeping like this? And I told this story in one of my groups, in my local group, in 2016. And one of my local followers said, I described the painting as kind of greens and browns and white and a little black. And he said, olive drab. And again, I was immediately overwhelmed by emotion. But that gave me the connection that I needed, which was that I realized I had not mourned the death of my roommate from the basic school, who had died in April of 1969. And so for 20 years, I had no idea why I'd had that emotional experience. And it was a very big one. And then all of a sudden I have it again, but this time I have some connection that told me, oh my God, this is what Jackson Pollock was doing. And this is why he was successful artist and attracted people like Peggy Guggenheim and many others. And others must have had, much more visceral experiences than I had most of the time. But I had the same experience sort of with Monet, where I see these postcards of lily ponds, and I say, who cares about that, right? And then we had a display of Monet up here in the Walters Gallery in Baltimore. And oh my God, I walk into the room and there's a painting with lily pads. It's about 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall. And the paint on it's about this thick. And immediately I grokked it. But you can't even appreciate something unless you're physically in its presence almost. Comments on that?
I must tell you a story about Monet and the lily ponds at Vernee. I was quite familiar with the very large paintings and with the very small paintings. And I went to Vernee with my daughter and another child and that child's parents. And we are near the little bridge that we're all familiar with. And we could hear someone talking. And my daughter and I are both fluent in French, so we could understand it was a French woman with her daughter. And the mother was explaining what was before her. And what we began to realize is that her daughter was blind.
Oh, wow.
And this child was entirely blind, and they were having this mother-daughter experience. And it was also very clear that the mother had previously introduced the child to the notion of the paintings, right? So this was, talk about like meta. This was so, it really helped me in a cognition of art. So my experiences in appreciating art, that's one of the important. There are some others I could tell you about, and they aren't like yours, Skip. They have to do with other what I would call a kind of bodily experiences of art. You see what I mean? And that one is one particular one. I mean, we're standing there, you can smell it. And that aspect of the aroma and of the breeze and of the rustling sound of, you know, the trees, what kind of trees they were. And then of course there's the love of the mother for the child. The child was a little older than my daughter, but not a lot older. So there was that we were both experiencing. Anyway, I mean, art transcends so much of what we think we know about reality.
Well, Annabelle, that's beautiful, because I was going to bring up the Tuileries at Vernee too, because in '89 I was there, and I remember just looking up, and someone said, "Why the perplexed eyes?" I said, "They're not perplexed. Listen to the leaves; they sound like running water." So it was almost like the aspen tree leaves, that you sound like a stream when you're next to a stream, like the chorus of the trees. And I look back when I got home, every flower was mislabeled by at least 2 labels, because I would sit down and I would write chrysanthemum, and I would turn around and see this beautiful bearded iris, and I would just start drawing it. And then I would turn around and see some other flower, and I would write its name, but then I would just be numinously inspired by another one, and I'd just draw it. And someone looks down and says, "You're drawing all the wrong flowers." And I'm like, words don't matter. I'm drawing flowers, you know, and I'd keep going. And even when I was consciously aware of it, I didn't stop doing it. It's just, I got shifted there. So I thoroughly appreciate the story there from an art critique and art expression perspective about the mother and the daughter who's blind, and her trying to viscerally communicate the experience through language so she can feel what's there. And that's beautiful. That's quite a story.
There's a wonderful movie called When Nietzsche Wept. Have any of you seen that movie? Well, it's about it. They bring up Breuer here, and the movie has some early work that Breuer was doing, and Freud was a very young man in his very early 20s that was sort of, you know, assistant to Breuer, and Nietzsche was coming in for something. I don't remember exactly why. It might have been because he couldn't weep, and he didn't understand why he couldn't weep, because that's the name of the movie, When Nietzsche Wept. And you know, it beautifully pulls together some of these ideas and sort of sets up what happened in the 20th century then, and some of the things we're talking about here. So let me go on. Paragraph 5.
Actually, right before you do, I'll insert another movie here in regards to this symptomatic blindness, that the various forms of symptomatic blindness. There's an Argentinian film called Man Facing Southeast. And it's a man who is repeatedly, almost methodically, cyclically admitted back into the mental institution. And, you know, when he starts being just quote unquote crazy in society, well, the policeman in one of the scenes says, you know, he never hurts anybody, but how do you know when to let him out? And he goes, oh, that's simple. It's when his art goes to shit. And so that, going back to Annabelle's piece about how to, you know, utilize art as a causative diagnostic tool in psychology, where his art would be horrible in society. He'd come back to the mental institution every day, discipline and ritual. He would go out, stand in the courtyard, and he would face southeast for hours. And then he would go paint. And there's that kind of getting lost in yourself piece. But when that stopped and his art just, you know, went all the heck, then it was time to readmit him back into society. And it made the gesture, by implication, that the people in the mental institution were actually the sane ones. They had creativity. They had rich inner lives, and the people outside were just reactionary and going along with the flow. And the people who were in prison were actually the ones in society, rather than the people who were safe were the ones in the mental institution.
So what was the name again, Jordan?
Man Facing Southeast. It's an Argentinian film.
Okay, I'm going to just put it in the chat here.
Since we seem to be on a really good movie theme, everyone's recommending.
Right. And that speaks again to that kind of quasi theme of captivity that we were talking about in relation to quote unquote sanity and quote unquote our insanity or unsaneness.
Definitely.
Skip, would you like me to read?
Yeah, paragraph 5.
Yes. After this digression, let us come back to the Breuer case. There were no organic causes for the disorder, so it had to be regarded as hysterical, that is, psychogenic. Breuer had observed that if during her twilight states, whether spontaneous or artificially induced, he got the patient to tell him of the reminiscences and fantasies that thronged in upon her, her condition was eased for several hours afterward. He made systematic use of this discovery for further treatment. The patient devised the name, quote, talking cure, close quote, for it, or jokingly, quote, chimney sweeping, close quote.
So now we know the origin of the term talking cure.
Right.
I like the chimney sweeping. That's a great image. Get all that hard creosote out of the psyche, clean it out. I mean, literally.
Yeah, but it's why coffee with a girlfriend works, right?
Right.
Or a boyfriend.
And then the expression bats in the belfry.
Yeah.
Right. And what's interesting even about the chimney sweep, if you let a chimney go too long, the creosote actually, rather than insulating the chimney flue, actually becomes flammable. So it becomes volatile. So psychological contents left unchecked like that over time will then become volatile, just like a chimney. So it's interesting. That image is really strong. I think the chimney sweep.
Yeah. So paragraph 6, the patient had become ill when nursing her father in his fatal illness. Naturally, her fantasies were chiefly concerned with these disturbing days. Reminiscences of this period came to the surface during her twilight states when photographic fidelity, so vivid were they, down to the last detail, that we can hardly assume the waking memory to have been capable of such plastic and exact reproduction. The name hypermnesia has been given to this intensification of the power of memory, which not infrequently occurs in restricted states of consciousness. Remarkable things now came to light. One of the many stories told ran somewhat as follows. One night, watching by the sick man who had a high fever, she was tense with anxiety because a surgeon was expected from Vienna to perform an operation. Her mother had left the room for a while, and Anna, the patient, sat by the sickbed with her right arm hanging over the back of the chair. She fell into a sort of waking dream in which she saw a black snake coming apparently out of the wall toward the sick man as though to bite him. It is quite likely that there really were snakes in the meadow at the back of the house, which had already given the girl a fright, and which now provided the material for the hallucination, it says hallucination. She wanted to drive the creature away, but felt paralyzed. Her right arm, hanging over the back of the chair, had gone to sleep. It had become anesthetic and paretic. And as she looked at it, the fingers changed into little serpents with death's heads. Probably she made efforts to drive away the snake with her paralyzed right hand, so that the anesthesia and paralysis became associated with the snake hallucination. when the snake had disappeared, she was so frightened that she wanted to pray, but all speech failed her. She could not utter a word until finally she remembered an English nursery rhyme, and then she was able to go on thinking and praying in English. I had an experience like this. It was when I was probably 4 years old. I was living on the Mojave Desert, and my grandfather had been on the railroad for 50 years, and he was coming to visit us, and I was put in a bedroom to take a nap. And while I was in this nap, all of a sudden I saw a train coming up the bed toward me, like a little electric train might come, except very slowly. And geez, it scared the hell out of me. I still remember it. And I have the sense today that it was, something like a snake dream. But that I had, maybe my mother had described a train like a snake or something like that. And so I had conflated the idea of the train and the snake, but I couldn't wake up. I was awake, I was conscious of it, but I couldn't move. I suppose it was some kind of dream, but I don't really know at this point. It's a long while ago.
That's interesting. I'll contribute. I'll share that in the year 2000, when I was up on Mount Democrat and stuck on the backside in the scree field, and I won't go into the whole long story, but I was day dressed because it was 70 something degrees in the afternoon. But of course, by 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, it was 19 degrees, and I'm in shorts and a t-shirt. And I just decided to say, the cold is not pain. It's simply a sensation. And then in a sense, I kind of self-morphined it out. Well, what's interesting now is, to this day, this is how many decades later, I can tell you when it's 19 degrees, because at 20, it's really cold. And at 19, I'll be taking my coat off. And everyone's, what? I said, it's not cold. And then I'll have to stop and go, danger, because at 18, it gets cold again. But at just that 1 degree temperature, I don't feel any cold at all. And that stuck from then all the way to now. And it's some people, can tell you it's going to rain because their knee. I can tell you it's 19 degrees because of back then. And it's not something I've ever been able to get at, to unseat, but it's just such a marked, indelible piece. I just leave it alone. It's not a dangerous kind of psychological feature. Yeah. But similar to that, where you're trained, you were terrified, and the associative pieces there drive something physiologically. So
let me just get the next 4 lines, which are paragraph 7, and then I'll defer to Annabelle to do paragraph 8. Which, good luck. It's one of the long ones. It's almost 2 pages long. So paragraph 7. Such was the scene in which the paralysis and the speech disturbance originated, and with the narration of this scene, the disturbance itself was removed. In this manner, the case is said to have been finally cured. Interesting. I don't know of anything around my little dream there, except what I told you. So I don't know what I was thinking at that time. I was only 4 years old. So,
but the fact, I think that what's to me, what's substantially important, and with your piece there, was it moved you so deeply, just like the Jackson Pollock, where the reasons are unreasonable. Something interior, in you was moved that deeply and that intensely by that experience.
Yeah. Okay. So Annabelle, you want to read paragraph?
Here we go. Not very loud if you want me to stop. Otherwise, I'll just keep this train moving ahead.
Let's go.
I must content myself with just one example. In the book I have mentioned by Breuer and Freud, there is a wealth of similar examples. It can readily be understood that scenes of this kind make a powerful impression, and people are therefore inclined to impute causal significance to them in the genesis of the symptom. The view of hysteria, then current, which derived from the English theory of the, quote, nervous shock, close quote, energetically championed by Charcot, was well qualified to explain Breuer's discovery. Hence, there arose the so-called trauma theory, which says that the hysterical symptom, and insofar as the symptoms constitute the illness, hysteria in general, derived from psychic injuries or traumata, whose imprint persists unconsciously for years. Freud, now collaborating with Breuer, was able to furnish abundant confirmation of this discovery. It turned out that none of the hundreds of hysterical symptoms arose by chance. They were always caused by psychic occurrences. So far, the new conception opened up an extensive field for empirical work. But Freud's inquiring mind could not remain long on this superficial level, for already deeper and more difficult problems were beginning to emerge. It is obvious enough that moments of extreme anxiety, such as Breuer's patient experienced, may leave an abiding impression. But how did she come to experience them at all, since they already clearly bear a morbid stamp? Could the strain of nursing bring this about? If so, there ought to be many more occurrences of the kind, for there are unfortunately very many exhausting cases to nurse, and the nervous health of the nurse is not always of the best. To this problem, medicine gives an excellent answer. Quote, the X in the calculation is predisposition, close quote. One is just, quote, predisposed, close quote, that way. But for Freud, the problem was what constitutes the predisposition. This question leads logically to an examination of the previous history of the psychic trauma. It is a matter of common observation that exciting scenes have quite different effects on the various persons involved, or that things which are indifferent or even agreeable to one person arouse the greatest horror in others. Witness frogs, snakes, mice, cats, etc. There are cases of women who will assist at bloody operations without turning a hair, while they tremble all over with fear and loathing at the touch of a cat. I remember a young woman who suffered from acute hysteria following a sudden fright. She had been to an evening party and was on her way home about midnight in the company of several acquaintances when a cab came up behind them at full trot. The others got out of the way, but she, as though spellbound with terror, kept to the middle of the road and ran along in front of the horses. The cabman cracked his whip and swore. It was no good. She ran down the whole length of the road, which led across a bridge. There her strength deserted her, and to avoid being trampled on by the horses, she would, in her desperation, have leapt into the river had not the passers-by prevented her. Now, this same lady who happened to be in St. Petersburg on the bloody 22nd of January, 1905, in the very street which was cleared by the volleys of the soldiers. All around her, people were falling to the ground, dead or wounded. She, however, quite calm and clear-headed, espied a gate leading into a yard through which she made her escape into another street. These dreadful moments caused her no further agitation. She felt perfectly well afterward. Indeed, rather better than usual.
Interesting. That scene of the soldiers is actually depicted in Dr. Zhivago in the beginning of the movie, Dr. Zhivago, when Natasha, with her noble family, is living in their nice home, and then the revolutionaries start coming after them. It wasn't until 12 years later that they overthrew the nobility, but anyway, it's interesting that this woman didn't let it phase her at all.
Well, and it felt like then the trauma, the new trauma, the intense death scene, balanced out and canceled out her previous trauma, as if the new trauma healed her. Because, like you said, she felt even better than normal.
Well, but what is healing? I mean, that's that question that, we can go back to the captivity or the ability to assimilate, or what does therapy do? What do psychopharmacological products do? What is life?
I love that question, because for example, the psychological modality called brain spotting is not a talking cure. It's a more of a visceral piece. And the concept is that where your eyes were locked at the point of trauma burns an indelible place in your brain. And by focusing back on any given spot where you feel a charge in your body, that with no words, you just watch it, and it opens a portal, and that trauma is always fresh. It's been incarcerated in captivity since then at that point. But what's interesting, when it walks in, whether it's Tasmanian devil screaming, raging, or calmly, you don't say any words. You just experience it and let it do what it does. And at most say, do you have a message for me? And what's interesting is then there's this point where you'll just get a tingle, and it's as if it went back home, like you got dosed with more of yourself. And so the healing aspect is almost taking that trauma and giving it its life back in a way, from which I find is a great polar example to the talking cure kind of talk therapy. Just to contrast and put them together as a
well, and it's a contrast between receiving the message. So my example of being at Vernee, and there just happened to be a woman speaking to a blind child. Your experience of the Elks, Jordan, just as one random example. Skip,
right.
Your experience of the Pollock painting. I mean, these were messages that were brought to us. So instead of us talking through things, we've somehow had things, and I don't mean things, I mean messages. I mean healing and divine. I think interventions is actually a good word for it. Interventions that have been brought to us as we do and live and become and whatever else we're doing.
Yeah, to me, this paragraph seemed like PTSD, and what made it made me think of the deer in the headlights that couldn't move, and I have a very, very mild case of PTSD, but I do have it, and it comes from Vietnam in two ways. One is whenever a helicopter flies by outside my house, and since I live next to the U.S. Naval Academy, that's quite frequently. And the other time, and when that happens, I'm right back in combat base Baldy. Okay, I'm back there as soon as I hear the helicopter. And the other one is when we have fireworks. And, I came back from Vietnam thinking, yeah, I'm fine, no problem. And the first summer, just a few weeks after I was back, let's say 3 months after I was back, I went out on the Niagara River on my father-in-law's boat. He had a beautiful Chris Craft 30-footer, and we were out in the Niagara River, and the fireworks started, and whoo! All of a sudden, I almost jumped out of the boat. I was really, shocked by that. And so since then, I've learned that I cannot go out and watch fireworks outside anymore. I can watch it on television, especially if there's a symphony playing Stars and Stripes Forever or something like that. But I cannot, if I go outside here and we're maybe 2 miles downriver from the Naval Academy and they're firing off fireworks, I start to smell the cordite and things from the explosions, and I get extremely anxious. It's extremely uncomfortable. And it's not from any one thing, it's because of, multiple things over a 9-month period that eventually amounted to trauma,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of trauma.
It was 9 months that you were in Vietnam then?
Yeah, I was in Vietnam 9 months, and often I was hearing explosions and firing, and often I was hearing helicopters almost daily. In fact, daily, no doubt, daily, because we had lots of helicopters around.
Yeah, I remember actually at a gas station, this is years ago, talking just on the highway somewhere traveling and talking to this Vietnam vet who was at the gas pump, right across from my car. We're just both filling up and chatting. Well, I finish and I go and I clap up the lever, and I'm like, well, wait a second, I need to take it back down. But when I clapped it up, it made that smack noise. He was on the pavement like that. I mean, he stopped, he dropped to the ground, and then he looked up, and you could just see the startle. And I went, I apologize. He goes, you couldn't have known. I didn't know. I just haven't heard a loud noise in so long. And he knew it was right what it was. But that same kind of trauma-born response was instant.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take up paragraph 9 then. Let's see. The failure.
I'll have my copy next week so I can.
Okay, the failure to react to an apparent shock can frequently be observed. Hence, it necessarily follows that the intensity of a trauma has very little pathogenic significance in itself, but it must have a special significance for the patient. That is to say, it is not the shock as such that has a pathogenic effect upon all circumstances, but in order to have an effect, it must impinge on a special psychic disposition, which may in certain circumstances consist of the patient's unconsciously attributing a specific significance to the shock. Here we have a possible key to the predisposition. We have therefore to ask ourselves, what are the particular circumstances of the scene with the cab? The patient's fear began with the sound of trotting horses. For an instant, it seemed to her that this portended some terrible doom, her death, and something as dreadful. The next moment, she lost all sense of what she was doing. Okay, comments.
The disassociation comes to mind. The next moment, she lost all sense of what she was doing. The disconnect, the disassociation that's associated there.
Yeah. Well, for me, I can say that I lose all sense of what I'm doing when a helicopter flies by. I certainly do. And, I'm immediately back in a Vietnam environment. And obviously you're very alert and looking for ways to keep yourself alive in those circumstances. And it's always the same. It never gets better. It hasn't faded in, what is it? I guess it's 50 years since I've been back. It still is the same, but now I've managed to corral it. I put a lasso around it. And so, within 15 to 30 seconds, I'm able to say, okay, that's my PTSD acting up and I can get back to work. But, I definitely go over there in that 1 minute's time and then have to bring myself back and say, okay, no worries. And, and with fireworks, I just don't do it anymore. I mean, when my wife and mother-in-law go out to watch the fireworks outside, I say, no, thanks, I'm going to watch on TV.
It's interesting to me. It starts out, the failure to react to an apparent shock. And then that coupled with the shock does not have a pathogenetic effect, where it's not the shock that's causing. So it feels like there's something else going on there too, that they're alluding to, but not calling out so much. It struck me with the failure to react to an apparent shock. Like, I guess the two only innate fears are loud noises and falling. And you can train them both away, but that's a kind of a reverse trauma in a way, to not react to an apparent shock. But then there's a psychological input that you have installed, basically, which is akin to a trauma. It's just not negative, maybe.
Okay, there's two more very long paragraphs here, and I will take upon myself the 2-page paragraph. So, Annabelle, are you willing to take the 1-page long?
I don't mind at all. No, I don't
right.
mind at all reading. I enjoy it.
All right, so paragraph 10.
I'll go to 10 now and then we'll see where we are. Okay. The real shock evidently came from the horses. The patient's predisposition to react in so unaccountable a way to this unremarkable incident might therefore consist in the fact that horses have some special significance for her. We might conjecture, for instance, that she once had a dangerous accident with horses. This was actually found to be the case. As a child of about 7, she was out for a drive with her coachman when suddenly the horses took fright and at a wild gallop made for the precipitous bank of a deep river gorge. The coachman jumped down and shouted to her to do likewise, but she was in such deadly fear that she could hardly make up her mind. Nevertheless, she jumped in the nick of time while the horses crashed with the carriage into the depths below. That such an event would leave a very deep impression scarcely needs proof. Yet, it does not explain why, at a later date, such an insensate reaction should follow the perfectly harmless hint of a similar situation. So far, we know only that the later symptom had a prelude in childhood, but the pathological aspect of it still remains in the dark. In order to penetrate this mystery, further knowledge is needed. For it had become clear with increasing experience that in all the cases analyzed so far, there existed, apart from the traumatic experiences, another special class of disturbances which lie in the province of love. Admittedly, quote, love, close quote, is an elastic concept that stretches from heaven to hell and combines in itself good and evil, high and low. With this discovery, Freud's views underwent a considerable change. If more or less under the spell of Breuer's trauma theory, he had formerly sought the cause of neurosis in traumatic experiences, now the center of gravity of the problem shifted to an entirely different point. This is best illustrated by our case. We can understand well enough why horses should play a special part in the life of the patient, but we do not understand the later reaction, so exaggerated and uncalled for. The pathological peculiarity of the story lies in the fact that she is frightened of quite harmless horses, remembering the discovery that besides the traumatic experience, there is often a disturbance in the province of love. We might inquire whether perhaps there is something peculiar in this connection.
Right. Okay. maybe we should just try to read on and get through 15. So I'll read the next paragraph because this all is of a piece.
Yeah.
Okay, so paragraph 11, the lady knows a young man to whom she thinks of becoming engaged. She loves him and hopes to be happy with him. At first, nothing is discoverable, but it would never do to be deterred from investigation by the negative results of the preliminary questioning. There are indirect ways of reaching the goal when the direct way fails. We therefore return to the singular moment when the lady ran headlong in front of the horses. We inquire about her companions and what sort of festive occasion it was in which she had just taken part. It had been a farewell party for her best friend who was going abroad to a health resort on account of her nerves. This friend is married, and we are told happily. She is also the mother of a child. We may take leave to doubt the statement that she is happy, for were she really so, she would presumably have no reason to be nervous and in need of cure. Shifting any angle of approach, I learned that after her friends had rescued her, they brought the patient back to the house of her host. Her best friend's husband, as this was the nearest shelter at that late hour of the night. There she was hospitably received in her exhausted state. And at this point, the patient broke off her narrative because became embarrassed, fidgeted, and tried to change the subject. Evidently, some disagreeable reminiscence had suddenly bobbed up. After the most obstinate resistance had become overcome, it appeared that yet another very remarkable incident had occurred that night. The amiable host had made her a fiery declaration of love, thus precipitating a situation in which the absence of the lady of the house might well be considered both difficult and distressing. Ostensibly, this declaration of love came to her like a bolt from the blue, but these things usually have their history. It was now the task of the next few weeks to dig out, bit by bit, a long love story until at last a complete picture emerged, which I attempted to outline somewhat as follows. As a child, the patient had been a regular tomboy, caring only for her wild boy's games, scorning her own sex and avoiding all feminine ways and occupations. After puberty, when the erotic problem might have come too close, she began to shun all society, hated and despised everything that even remotely reminded her of the biological destiny of a woman, and lived in the world of fantasies which had nothing in common with rude reality. Thus, until about her 24th year, she evaded all those little adventures, hopes, and expectations which ordinarily move a girl's heart at this age. Then she got to know two men who were destined to break through the thorny hedge that had grown up around her. Mr. A was her best friend's husband, and Mr. B was her bachelor friend. She liked them both. Nevertheless, it soon began to look as though she liked Mr. B a vast deal better, and intimacy quickly sprang up between them, and before long there was talk of a possible engagement. Through her relationship with Mr. B and through her friend, she often came into contact with Mr. A, whose presence sometimes disturbed her in the most unaccountable way and made her nervous. About this time, the patient went to a large party. Her friends were also there. She became lost in thought, and was dreamily playing with her ring when it suddenly slipped off her finger and rolled under the table. Both gentlemen looked for it, and Mr. B succeeded in finding it. He placed the ring on her finger with an arch smile and said, "You know what this means," unquote. Overcome by a strange and irresistible feeling, she tore the ring from her finger and flung it through the open window. A painful moment ensued, as may be imagined, and soon she left the party in deep dejection. Not long after this, so-called chance brought it about that she should spend her summer holidays at a health resort where Mr. and Mrs. A were also staying. Mrs. A then began to grow visibly nervous and frequently stayed indoors because she felt out of sorts. The patient was thus in a position to go out for walks along with Mr. A. On one occasion, they were boating. So boisterous was she in her merriment that she suddenly fell overboard. She could not swim, and it was only with great difficulty that Mr. A pulled her half conscious into the boat, and then it was that he kissed her. With this romantic episode, the bonds were tied fast, but the patient would not allow the depths of this passion to come into consciousness, evidently because she had long habituated herself to pass over such things, or better, to run away from them. To excuse herself to her own, in her own eyes, she pursued her engagement to Mr. B all the more energetically, telling herself every day that it was Mr. B whom she loved. Naturally, this curious little game had not escaped the keen glances of wifely jealousy. Mrs. A, her friend, had guessed the secret and fretted accordingly, so that her nerves only got worse. Hence, it became necessary for Mrs. A to go abroad for a cure. At the farewell party, that the evil spirit stepped up to our patient and whispered in her ear, "Tonight he is alone. Something must happen to you so that you can go to his house." And so indeed it happened. Through her own strange behaving, she came back to his house and thus attained her desire. Okay, sounds like Peyton Place. Okay, Annabelle, paragraph 12.
My mute is coming up. I was so carried away listening to you, I didn't turn my page.
Okay, well,
As a
we're on
child,
page
the patient had
17.
been a regular. No, you read all through that. As a child, the patient had been a regular tomboy. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're at
So
paragraph
we're
12.
at that other one. After this explanation, everyone will probably be inclined to assume that only a devilish subtlety could devise such a chain of circumstances and set it to work. There is no doubt about subtlety, but its moral evaluation remains a doubtful matter, because I must emphasize that the motives leading to the dramatic denouement were in no sense conscious. To the patient, this whole story seemed to happen of itself, without her being conscious of any motive. But the previous history makes it perfectly clear that everything was unconsciously directed to this end, while the conscious mind was struggling to bring about the engagement to Mr. B. The unconscious drive in the other direction was stronger. Shall I continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
So once more, we return to our original question, namely, whence comes the pathological, that is, peculiar or exaggerated, nature of the reaction to the trauma? On the basis of a conclusion drawn from analogous experiences, we conjectured that, in this case, too, there must be, in addition to the trauma, a disturbance in the erotic sphere. This conjecture has been entirely confirmed, and we have learnt that the trauma, the ostensible cause of the illness, is no more than an occasion for something previously not conscious to manifest itself. That is, an important erotic conflict. Accordingly, the trauma loses its exclusive significance and is replaced by a much deeper and more comprehensive conception, which sees the pathogenic agent as an erotic conflict. Continue.
If you want, yeah, why don't you finish the
One
chapter?
often hears the question, why should the erotic conflict be the cause of the neurosis rather than any other conflict? To this, we can only answer, no one asserts that it must be so, but in point of fact, it frequently is so. In spite of all indignant protestation to the contrary, the fact remains that love, and there's a footnote about love, we won't go there, its problems and its conflicts, is of fundamental importance in human life, and as careful inquiry consistently shows, is of far greater significance than the individual suspects. The trauma theory has therefore been abandoned as antiquated. For with the discovery that not the trauma, but a hidden erotic conflict is the root of the neurosis, the trauma loses its causal significance.
Interesting. Okay, and the footnote is using the word in the wider sense that belongs to it by right and embraces more than sexuality. This is not to say that love and its disturbances are the only source of neurosis. Such disturbances may be of secondary nature and conditioned by deeper lying causes. There are other ways of becoming neurotic, genuine shock neurosis like shell shock, railway spine, etc., form an exception. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. So comments, we read a bunch.
I find it interesting that they dispense with the trauma as causative after it's replaced by a deeper psychological feature, that it feels like the trauma was maybe not causative, but certainly indicative of the onset. And then something in the unconscious grabs a hold of it. And then that's the causative piece, if that's the insinuation they're making. Otherwise, I would say the trauma itself is causative, and then it evolves as it steeps into the psyche to become a deeper psychological feature. There seemed to be a conflict to me in the logic of dispensing with the trauma as causative, when it was, in a sense, the seed that then popped open the oak tree of the deeper psychological subtle feature. If that sinks in with anyone, does that?
Yeah, Marilyn, do you have any thought here? Can't hear you.
No, you're muted.
Please unmute.
I don't have a thought on that, but on a related note, there's my book is almost a word for word translation. It's not exactly the same, but there's one part where it says the word, you're reading it, and it says woman. It had to do with the woman. And in my book, in the translation, it says man. So I wonder if the person who was translating it even got confused, because I had to read it several times over. So I agree with you. It does not reverberate with me. It does not make sense to me, but
yeah, it seems like they're talking out both
haven't-
sides of their mouth.
pardon me, I didn't hear what you said.
It seems like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. I mean, they're trying to, yeah, it didn't sit right, that last piece.
Yeah, it's as if they had one situation, but it would not pertain to everybody. It would have to be really unusual that you know that same person. I just thought it was a little bit strange. I could not go along with it.
Well, I think this demonstrates where they were struggling at the turn of the 20th century. They really just didn't know. And my reaction to it at this point is that, she had the experience. Obviously, she didn't know why she was doing it. And then, like the Tarot, the experience finds a psychological hook, and then it goes back and finds an explanation for the psychological hook, which isn't necessarily how the whole situation came down. Okay, another word, right?
Mhm.
I mean, Jordan, you're the expert on this, so.
Well, I'm asked all the time, how does tarot work? And I started when I was 7, but I don't think I could say these spare few words until like the last year. I think simply it's not just tarot. Any visual image, for example, the olive drab, Pollock, any visual image strikes chords to resonate in the imagination. And I think then that rings the dinner bell for the unconscious to well up archetypal contents to then amplify.
And material
then
that's
associate.
personal, possibly.
Right, also along with it.
I would say it's not only visual image, it's anything. It can be a sound or
any experiential feature. And I think that even goes to show, I would say, Annabelle's story with the Tuileries at Vernee, with the mother experientially communicating to connect with her daughter to posit that visceral experience that she is not, audibly or visually able to experience. So then in a sense she paints a word picture, almost probably proetic, probably poem and prose at the same time to navigate that idea into her brain or into her psyche, so that she can share the connection she's feeling, and her daughter can feel it too.
Yeah, I mean, just think of the experience of Helen Keller,
right,
who was born deaf and blind, and she was able to learn to communicate because she experienced water, I think, and so her teacher then, I guess, wrote water on her face or something like that. And so she saw she understood a connection. And then from that, she was able to build out an entire psyche, still unable to see or hear, but she was able to give entire lectures about it later on in her life.
And Stephen Hawking, a reverse example of that, where some of his best work when he was basically incarcerated or captive within himself and learning to talk in a different way. Loss of a sense it's interesting how it sometimes amplifies other senses and how it just causes an evolution. Like the neuroplasticity in the brain is just activated to then not just accommodate and substitute, but to keep advancing.
Okay, so the next thing that's coming up next week is chapter 2, which is the Eros theory, everyone's favorite. And sorry, my voice is just.
Yeah, me and Freud we don't see anywhere near eye to eye.
Yeah.
Lie down and tell me about your mother. It's like, will you get off your own stuff, please? I don't need your baggage. I have my own.
Yeah, absolutely. Any further comments before we hang it up for tonight, Annabelle?
There's so much that we've touched on, and there are many layers underneath this, surface of the water that we've touched on. I feel like we could sit here and talk for hours. I don't really want to go off on another tangent. I mean, my experience of becoming blind in one eye last year Thanksgiving, which this you all know something about, and which I am discovering more about every single day, has been very much informed by everything we've said tonight. I have not thought about the deer in the headlights in relation to that moment of blindness, but I do seem to have gone blind looking into headlights. Literally. I mean, that's what, me and the doctors talking about it have kind of distilled it down to, yes, it was that moment. You had come out of the woods, the headlights were coming towards you, and that's when it was shutting down. That's what the doctors say. So acute angle closure, I don't know, I mean, somewhere, I think there are some, we've come up with some answers.
And
Right-
then
right here tonight.
you recovered your sight though.
With these insane drops, prednisone, lampadampazine, and I don't know, like these horrible, horrible chemicals in the ER.
Mhm.
I did go fully blind in one eye. And then they did fully bring it back.
Wow.
But of course, it's not as simple as that. And they did these things they call iridectomies, where they put lasers through the irises, first one, and then or weeks later, the other one. This is the one that had closed. They opened it up with the chemicals. They shot through with more than 300 laser shots and allowed it to drain. That was their, sort of medical definition of what they were doing, creating a drain. The other eye, since that operation, drifts. That's the common term for it. I have a drifting left eye, which I never had it before.
Wow, that's wild too, because that's the eye that kept sight, right?
Yes.
That's
and
wild.
and that one, they did the iridectomy as a, preemptive or whatever you want to call it, so that I wouldn't go blind in that eye. But with that one, he said that only took about 8 shots, laser shots. Whereas this one took over 300 laser shots. Completely different day, different circumstance in a way, different office and different people. But he, who was, who's like chief in charge of all the other people, he's the one who did this eye, which now is the eye that has a quote unquote problem.
That's really wild.
But they now can't solve. Now I'm wearing the old, this I'm sure I've talked to, the circle about. I'm wearing the old glasses before because no glasses work. And the proper prescription, I keep on quotes around things because nothing has a hard and fast definition. But when they tried to give me a prescription for what the vision test said, I couldn't even walk. I had even 2D vision didn't work. Now, this is 2D, this is 3D.
It makes me think, say in the times of Freud, they might have called it hysterical blindness.
Right.
And now there's a physiological reason, there's a treatment.
Right.
So I think that's one of the things that gets me. The times have changed so drastically.
Mhm.
Thank goodness for you that there is treatment for this. There's a name for it, and you're not being, because I know people who would be told, oh, that's hysterical, whatever it is. And they were told, I know people who've had that happen, oh, you're hysterical.
Yeah, I don't disagree with them, though. The people who call it hysterical, because it happened on November 26th, the blindness. On November 16th, my dog was put down, lethal injection. I loved the dog. I hadn't been with him for years and years or anything, but we had a tremendous bonding. Now, after I had all these ordeals, I had phone calls from the vet, and they were surprised they couldn't reach me. And they said, we have his remains, right? The urn was returned, right?
Mhm.
That's why we've been trying to reach you. So I went in and I talked to this wonderful woman, who worked for this wonderful doctor. Not entirely wonderful, but he talked me through the whole process. And the dog died November 16th. The incident happened November 26th. Those 10 days I cried more than I have in my entire life. no death, no other experience has ever brought as much tears to my eyes.
Mhm.
And so when I went to pick up the urn and had a conversation, I said, well, I've been in now the ER 3 times and the neurologist can't figure out blah, 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 blah. And they gave me all these drops. She said, well, obviously, you were crying and your eyes went blind. I know how you felt. And this was the receptionist in the veterinary clinic. On many levels, I believe her, quote unquote science more than I believe anything any of these, MDs have said to me, tried to explain to me. I'm seeing an endocrinologist for the 4th time coming up, all related to this, right? I think the vet receptionist is the one who's got it, and that's related to what you're saying, Marilyn, right?
It's
that's-
a very amazing, that's a
Yeah.
very amazing side to it. Thank you for sharing that information. My
Well,
goodness.
thank you. I wouldn't have if you hadn't said what you said, though, Marilyn. So thank you for saying what you said, because, and that's part of the 2D, 3D. One of my biggest lessons over this period of time is learning about dimensionality in experience
Mhm.
and contemplating 4th dimension and beyond, because I have to.
Mhm.
I don't
Right.
have a choice.
Interesting.
Well,
I have to
it's really
take my
resonant.
glasses off to walk down a curb. Otherwise, I will be, lose that sense of weight because I don't know how steep any curb is with my glasses on.
Oh,
Wow. It's really resonant that, I mean, with your experience with your dog, that it's almost like your psyche saying, I can't see this. Like,
Yes.
And I have to thank you, because when I mentioned the elk stampeding, it was just really cool that they were
Yeah.
stampeding behind the cabin, except I was asleep. And it's interesting when you brought it up again. I mean, I wrote a big box, the elk stampeding, wake up.
Yes.
What is my stampeding? This huge, I had this cascade of tingles, like a very numinous experience. When you put it back to me, it's as if I heard it for the first time. So now I've got some nice exploration to do. So thank you.
Well, you spoke it in a way. I mean, you painted us a painting of the antlers. You gave us a beautiful artwork, right, to contemplate.
It's like a little mini film of them passing in the dark, and so. But when you said
the physicality of the cabin, I mean,
exactly. And then even I think I said it's like timpani playing in the cabin.
Right, exactly. The timpani you brought up.
Yeah. So when you brought it back up, it's as if I heard it for the first time, which was really, really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I've told you all about the vanishing point, that the vanishing point is not a vanishing point. It's a Mobius strip, right?
Right. Mobius strip. Right.
So thankfully I lost my sight and gained it back again, because look at how much I'm still learning.
Well, maybe you'll gain it back even further after this discussion tonight.
Well, exactly. That's the point, because this gave me new things to reflect on. Plus, we have a whole movie list.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have my whole
assignment. Skip next week. We have to watch all of these like 6 or 8 movies that we all mentioned tonight.
I've got movies set up for the whole next week.
15 minutes of Dr. Zhivago.
Yeah,
Man facing southeast.
When Nietzsche wept, and then Augustine.
And Augustine with Charcot, right? To review our Charcot. What these guys, Freud and Jung, where they were coming from. Who was their predecessor?
One thing, Annabelle, it strikes me as odd that the eye that remained having vision wanders, because you would think like a knee surgery, you would favor it. I mean, I had a wandering eye as a kid. I thought my parents were psychic, because how do you always know when I'm tired? They said, because your eyes stuck up. They didn't tell me till years later, this right eye just wandered up.
Right.
And it was what it was
time to go to bed.
Yeah. And so they're like, and I'm like, how do you always know? Well, it was because this eye was 2015 and this eye was 2020. And what happened is 2020 is perfect average, but it was the weaker eye. So the muscles weren't as owl focused.
Oh yeah,
But-
I have these exercises I'm supposed, and I've seen the pictures of, what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
my muscles stronger. And I get it. I've gotten wonderful images of what those muscles look like and how the eyeball bobbles around. And then, of course, I've had experiences of how the back of the optic nerve, it connects into the brain, which connects to the cranium, the base of the cranium, which connects into the digestive tract, because it was the eye doctors who said, because I said to them, why was I throwing up? You know? And then I went, I mean, I was throwing up and then I went blind, right? I said, why was I throwing up? They said, well, because it's all connected. And that's the optic nerve, which is connected to
Oh, wow.
which is the digestive tract. I was like, what? You know,
Yeah, there's your Mobius strip right in your body.
it's right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything is so connected. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It is amazing.
Well, and this is why even acupuncture and various kinds of meditation and shamanism work too.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
Well, even Jung, real quick, even Jung, this may be anecdotal and it may be made up, but it may have come from some movie, but that someone would come in complaining of stomach issues and he would simply say, what can't you stomach? Or I have a throat issue. What can't you swallow? You know, I mean, he would immediately put the body with the psyche.
Yeah.
So
Of course, and that's the strength of Marion Woodman's work. So, okay, folks, thank you for being here. Next week, we'll go into the second chapter, which is what Eros.
The Eros theory?
Yeah, the Eros theory. Okay, so we're talking.
I hope they prove it.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to lose that stuff.
So we're all living proof of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Jordan. So, okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Peace. See you
Yes,
again.
thank you so much. Thank you.